Welcome to Medical Myths, Legends, and Fairy Tales. I'm your host, Dr. Alan Christianson. Look, you know that between the latest online fads and the crazy media headlines, it's easier than ever to get confused about your health. And you and I just want to feel better and live longer. We want to know what works. And we can't wait for further studies. We need to make decisions today based on the best evidence we've got. Well, that's exactly what this show is here for. So let's get to it.
Hi there, this is Dr. Linda Kushaba from Integrative Health. Would you like some help with your thyroid? We would absolutely love to help you out. And guess what? We can even do remote care. Please call us today at 480-657-0003 to set up your first appointment. If you mention code podcast20, you will get 20% off from your first visit. That phone number again is 480-657-0003, and the code is podcast20. Can't wait to meet you.
Humans eat meat, animal protein, lots of it. Right or wrong, over 92% of most populations do consume it on a daily basis. We've talked about the health implications both ways, but there's also the thoughts about the environmental, the humanitarian, the global quality of life impacts, water, carbon off-gassing, all these factors. So what if we could do that without raising animals? I think it's one of the most exciting concepts that we face in our time, and there plausibly could be a time within the next decade or so in which we look back and are just flabbergasted that we used to raise animals in order to eat meat. We actually could have animal protein, not better veggie burgers, but actual animal protein without raising animals. I'm super excited to speak with Elliot Swartz and share this interview with you. He's a senior scientist at the Good Food Institute. They're one of the organizations that's really pushing this technology forward and doing some research on this. It's exploding. The funding and the work going into it and the organizations involved is just going up largely in these last couple of years. Dr. Swartz is a PhD in neuroscience from the University of California, Los Angeles. He's worked with pluripotent stem cells and to model neuromuscular disease. Basically, he got good at copying nerve cells so he could see how diseases would act on nerve cells in cultures. And these same skills could be useful towards cultivating sustainable food for our future. So please enjoy this time with Elliot Swartz.
Hey, I'm here with Elliot Swartz. Elliot, how you doing today?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
Good. Hey, really thankful for your time and appreciative about this. And this is the topic I'm just really excited to share with my audience. Let's just start from the top. And I'll talk more about just why this is so important. But, we've got a lot of different folks out there. So most people are omnivores by default in terms of how they eat. Some choose to go vegan. We even have some carnivores out there nowadays that focus on carnivore diets. Mm-hmm. And then we've got a lot of plant-based burgers that are just getting a ton of attention. So why do we have a push? Why is there a need for some meat alternatives?
Yeah, so it's really a multifaceted issue. But the way that we like to think about why meat alternatives are becoming more and more prevalent are because of the kind of known externalities associated with industrial animal agriculture. And so to kind of frame this and put it in context, if you look towards the year 2050, the UN predicts that there will be probably around 9.7 billion people on Earth. And a lot of that growth in terms of population will occur in regions of sub-Saharan Africa and the Asia-Pacific region. These are generally regions that are less industrialized and have lower GDPs, but over time, these GDP is expected to increase, and generally when the kind of richness or GDP and industrialization of a country increases, their diets shift, and they shift towards a more meat-heavy diet. And so by the same year of 2050, it's expected that the global demand for meat will rise between 70 and 100%. We already know that meat production now accounts for around 14.5% or so of all greenhouse gas emissions. It's a leading cause of biodiversity loss and deforestation. And it's also a main driver of antibiotic resistance, as a lot of antibiotics are used not especially just for human purposes, but around 70 to 80% of all antibiotics that are human medically relevant actually go into animals. And so industrial animal agriculture has really a lot of different negative externalities associated with it, and producing meat in a different way through plants or through cultivating cells directly can mitigate a lot of these problems.
And that's where you come in. So let's talk a bit more about what is cultivated meat? What is this product?
Sure. So cultivated meat, people may also know it by the name of clean meat or cultured meat or cell-based meat. Some people call it lab-grown meat or synthetic meat, but we don't necessarily like those terminologies as they aren't quite as descriptive and positive. But essentially, the process involves growing cells directly without having to slaughter an animal, and we can do so by leveraging the decades of research done in stem cell biology and tissue engineering. And instead of applying those techniques, which we can talk about, into medicinal purposes or regenerative medicine purposes, we rather reapply them to animal stem cells to make food products. So, yeah, I've heard some different terms come and go, and it seemed like clean meat was a term a few years back, but then I guess that it was almost a blow to the conventional meat industry. Like, well, what are we? So right. Cultivated, cultured, what do you think we should expect moving forward for like the centralizing term? Yeah, so we and others have done a bit of consumer research surveys around this topic. And generally, if you frame things in a more positive manner and you actually educate the people that are receiving the information more about the positive outcomes of the potential positive outcomes of the technology and how it's made, those tend to fare better in terms of the response and receptiveness of people willing to try a product or pay more for a product, for instance. And a lot of the terms that we've tested in those consumer response and research surveys have been terms such as cultivated or craft or cell-based meat. And our most recent survey suggested that cultivated meat was, descriptive and able to be understood by those who were receiving the information that kind of described the process. So for now, that is a term that we're using, but I'd be willing to bet that there's still more to say on that front moving forward. And I saw there was a quote from Winston Churchill from the 40s where he was just saying, at some point in the future, we'll just be able to have to grow some chicken breast rather than grow a whole chicken and just eat the meat. And it seems so obviously like a useful step. Yeah, absolutely. I think his 50 years hence essay is what you're referring to, and that's been cited throughout the birth of this industry. And I think, it points to a signal that this idea has been around for quite a bit of time. It's just that the science hasn't really caught up until very recently that has allowed this to really start to take place and this industry to be born. So, new things come out in terms of food, and there are concerns. There are consumer concerns. Are these things strange? Are they playing God? Are they Frankenfoods or whatnot? And one of my biggest motivations for having this discussion with you is that I've looked at this quite a bit. I think it's got a ton of promise. I think there are certainly always things we have to be cautious about moving forward with anything new. But overall, I don't see big pitfalls, but I do see how there could be consumer fears that hold this back. So explain to us how this would fit with compared to other meat alternatives, how it would fit in that whole spectrum. Sure. So the way that we like to think about meat alternatives is just simply producing meat in different ways. And the way of production is how we kind of bucket them into three separate categories. The first category, which people are probably most familiar with, are plant-based meats, as these already exist on the market. Many of you may have already tried some of these products, the flagships being things like the Impossible or Beyond Burger. And how those are made are essentially by restructuring plant proteins into more fibrous textures that more accurately recapitulate the organoleptic properties of meat. And you can combine them with things like plant-based fats, and then supplement them with vitamins and minerals to make them match a nutritional profile of meat as best as possible. Another method that you can use is also what we refer to as kind of fermentation-based methods. And this is kind of more of a classical microbial production system using yeast or bacteria, or also fungi that can be used to produce animal-based proteins that are used, for instance, in milk. So there are companies in this space that are producing dairy proteins such as whey and casein, and they can be used as additives for a variety of different purposes, but they are truly an animal-based protein, but produced without the animal. And so there's a lot of work going on in that sector as well that will probably contribute to this whole kind of meat alternative sector. And then finally, the third bucket is just by cultivating animal cells directly. And I can go into more about the kind of specifics of that methodology.
So we've got really good high-tech veggie burgers, basically. And then we've got microbes that can be taught to make things they wouldn't normally make. I guess we've got like recombinant insulin, for an example of that. And then we have the case where you're really just copying the cells. Yeah, can you tell us a bit about the basic idea about how the process works, please?
Yeah, so essentially, what these companies in this sector are doing is they can take a small biopsy of tissue from a living animal or an animal that's been recently slaughtered. They can take that tissue back to the lab and isolate a stem cell population of interest. And there are a variety of different stem cell types that can be used for this production purpose, and a variety of different types that are being explored. The way to think about it is basically some stem cells are limited in the tissues that they can create. So a muscle stem cell generally creates just adult muscle tissues, whereas if you use something like an induced pluripotent stem cell, which is more embryonic-like, they can form multiple tissue types, and all of the tissue types of meat, for instance. From there, once you have a stem cell line that you're working with and that you've selected, the goal is really to produce a lot of stem cells in a kind of bioreactor environment. So these are generally environments that are more akin to a brewery than a lab, which is why lab-grown meat is not necessarily the most descriptive term. But you can imagine these kind of large vats that are spinning stir tank bioreactors, and there's also some other bioreactor models that are being explored for this industry. But the purpose of them is really to create really large densities and large numbers of stem cells. And then in the second phase of the process, those stem cells are transitioned or differentiated into the cellular components of meat. So primarily that means muscle tissue, but also fat tissues and connective tissues like cartilage or other kind of extracellular matrix type of proteins that are secreted by fibroblasts that make up connective tissues of meat. And the end goal there is really to either create those through independent methodology and recombine them at a later state, so producing things like fat and muscle independently and combining them into an unstructured product like a sausage or a chicken nugget at a later point in time. Or you could alternatively use a sort of scaffolding technology that allows the growth of fat and muscle and other tissue types all together on a single scaffold that more accurately kind of represents a structured product like a chicken breast or a fish fillet.
So a concern comes up about, are these different things that didn't exist before? Are these genetically manipulated animals? How is this? How would a strip of muscle fiber that was just taken, sliced really well at a microscopic level from a cow, how would that be different than a grown strip of muscle fiber?
Yeah, so I think that the exact answer to that is still a little bit TBD. But with that said, on a cellular and molecular level, these products are expected to be pretty much exactly the same as if they came from an animal, because they are indeed built from animal tissues. What could be different is that generally stem cell derived tissue types are a little less mature in terms of their physiology and some other parameters that you can measure within a cell. And so let's say, if you really want to get a really texturous piece of meat, a really fibrous, gamey piece of meat, that generally requires an animal that has, lived its life and has been exercising and grown its muscle tissue that's quite dense and large, et cetera. And we can mirror that in the lab through electrical stimulation that leads to muscle hypertrophy with cells that are grown in the dish. But to do so to the extent that it truly mirrors an animal-derived tissue is, I think, yet to be seen. But that is certainly the goal. And I think what's interesting about the cultivated meat process, if you compare it to something like regenerative medicine or tissue replacement therapy for humans, is that what we're really trying to do is not replicate the full function of the tissue, but rather just the arrangement of cells in a structure such that when you eat it, it resembles eating meat from all of its kind of organoleptic properties. And so in that respect, it's a little bit easier.
And the genes are not different, right?
That's correct. So you can certainly, the animal that you're taking it from does not need to be genetically modified. The whole process can be GMO-free. The regulations in this industry are still being conceived of, and it's unclear yet if some of the regulations that are, for instance, in plant agriculture with things like regulations around using CRISPR to eliminate a native gene rather than apply a transgene into a new organism, and that being allowable. It's yet to be seen whether that will be kind of adopted by this industry and the regulators that are building the frameworks for this industry. So yes, the process can be GMO-free. Companies are, I think, exploring genetic modifications for research and development purposes to improve the production efficiencies of their protocols. And it's yet to be seen whether that will carry out in the actual products that are released.
So how did you come to be aware of this industry, and what? I mean, you got a lot of options. You're a neuroscientist, and what brought you to be active with this?
Yeah, it's an interesting story because a lot of times when I give talks or something on this topic, I think people might be wondering why a neuroscientist is going to go talk to them about food for the next hour. But essentially in my graduate research, I focused a lot on the modeling of neuromuscular disorders using human stem cells to make tissues like skeletal muscle and neuronal tissues to study diseases. And during that time, I had heard about all of these companies that were essentially using the same techniques that I was developing in the lab to create muscle tissue, but not for medicine, but for food. And I started kind of really becoming obsessed with the idea due to learning more about, the kind of negative externalities with industrial animal agriculture that I talked about at the top of the podcast, and really just viewed it as a way to leverage my skills as a scientist to have a bigger impact. And so, I tell a lot of people and scientists that people that are interested in science that may be listening that this field is so interdisciplinary that I think, you may not think of it on its surface as something that is what you could do or be involved with, but there's a lot of ways to become involved with this as from a variety of different scientific disciplines.
I saw a graph on your site, and the funding for this is just exploding. It's just obviously the interest is really taking off these last couple of years.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think people may be familiar, if they have been familiar with the cultivated meat space. In 2013 was the kind of first public taste testing of a burger created by Mark Post, who's a physician in the Netherlands. And that work was funded by Sergey Brin from Google as kind of a proof of concept demonstration that this is really ready for being explored as a true kind of possibility to create meat. And that really catalyzed a lot of interest and formation of companies in this space. And so since, I think, late 2015, early 2016, there's since been around 50 or so companies founded globally that are all working on cultivated meat product development. And yeah, the investment in this industry has tracked that quite nicely as all of those companies are looking to be funded. And there's a lot of investor interest in this field because of really the opportunity that it presents to disrupt a multi-trillion-dollar global industry.
I think it's such an important thing. Part of my story was I've struggled with various health conditions, and I've resonated with all the arguments about those negative externalities of the meat industry, about the humanitarian issues, the environmental impacts, everything together collectively. And yet I see strong arguments about the benefits of plant-based diets from the inclusion of plants, but I don't see strong health arguments about the exclusion of animal foods. I mean, sure, you could say like high amounts of smoked, processed, cured meats. But much past that, I don't see strong arguments about the detriments. Personally, I tried many times to exclude animal foods from my diet, and I don't do as well from that. My health is just not, I've tried so many iterations of that. But if there were some version that didn't have the same environmental impact, the same humanitarian impact, boy, I would just be first on board to sign up. I don't know if your habits have been affected by the work here, or what your thoughts about that all yourself. Or...
Sure, yeah. People do ask me, that exact question. And I actually went vegetarian upon starting my job here. I was already eating less meat, but I feel like I had to walk the walk a bit if I was going to be talking the talk. And so I do think it's hard for a lot of people to fully switch to a plant-based diet or a fully vegan diet. And it could be hard because, they haven't done the appropriate research that leads them to choosing poor dietary choices that lead to negative health benefits. Or it could just be that, some things are just not one size fits all. And certainly having more options increases the ability of people to limit their meat reduction, which generally needs to happen, but do so in different ways. And so a lot of what we see is that the rise of this consumer called the flexitarian, which is essentially someone that still eats meat, but eats meat in a lesser amount. And so they may be replacing a normal hamburger with a plant-based burger, but they're still eating meat once a day or several times a week or something like that. And as more and more of these products alternatively produced come out and begin competing better and better on cost and price, taste, and convenience, I think we'll see more and more consumers being able to make that shift away from a heavily meat diet and incorporating meat alternatives. And of course, when cultivated meat products do come to market, they should basically give the same experience of eating meat and then being able to do so in a kind of guilt-free fashion as described. So I think, there's just so many benefits with these technologies.
We'll be right back after word from Integrative Health.
We hope you're enjoying this episode of Medical Myths, Legends, and Fairy Tales. This is Dr. Raquel Espinal at Integrative Healthcare. So often we hear from our new patients that their primary care physician has told them that their thyroid and hormone levels are fine and they should not worry. Yet the patients still have symptoms of severe fatigue, thinning hair, and weight issues. Unfortunately, this is too common with thyroid care. The good news is we can help, and there is hope. The doctors at Integrative Health, including myself, specialize in naturally treating your thyroid, your hormone, and adrenal issues. We would love to get you started on the path to ideal health. From the comfort of your own home, you can get treatment with one of the doctors at Integrative Health via telemedicine. Go to integrativehealthcare.com to become a new patient today. Use the code podcast20 for 20% off your new patient visit. Again, that is integrativehealthcare.com, and use the code podcast20, all one word. Get back to the road to thriving. We look forward to seeing you.
And now, back for more medical myths, legends, and fairy tales.
You mentioned about the antibiotic overuse. There's most who are watching news know that we don't have much for new antibiotics in the research pipeline, and drug resistance is a big concern. And a lot of that comes from just use in agriculture. So you can really drop that portion of it. Then also we think about just not just drug resistance outside of hospital settings or whatnot. We think about just foodborne illness. People that develop bladder infections, as simple as that, from handling foods unsafely in the kitchen, or E. coli infections. And so much of this could change just from this. It can be ultimately be more sterile product. The water usage, the environmental impacts, just so many factors to it.
Yeah, that's correct. And a lot of people question, how do we grow cells in a really large volume and maintain sterility and not use antibiotics? Like, don't cells need an immune system to defend off bacterial invasions, et cetera? And I think it's worth mentioning that, in the kind of vaccine industry and the biopharmaceutical industry, a lot of effort has been put on place on creating filtration systems and sterilization systems in bioreactor environments, such that a really high value product like a biologic drug is not ruined by a contamination event. And so a lot of those technologies that have been developed over the past 2 decades or so in those industries can now be easily applied to the cultivated meat industry to basically prevent entirely the use of antibiotics throughout the process. And as you mentioned, that has really rippling effects, because that means that a product that comes off the line is completely sterile. And so the only contamination event that can occur would be due to, instances during the packaging phase or shipping phase after the production itself. This should allow for, in theory, increased shelf life times and decreased food waste across the meat sector as well if this technology was adopted. It also has kind of rippling effects for when you think about the environmental impacts of shipping things on ice or in cold refrigerated environments. You can probably ship these products at room temperature without having them to, become spoiled during the process. And that's huge in things like the seafood industry, for instance. So I think there's some data points out there. Nothing's been publicly peer reviewed yet on those sorts of studies, but all signals point to those things probably holding true. And then, you mentioned other things like zoonotic disease outbreaks. So things like swine flu and avian flu that generally wouldn't become as much of an issue if animals weren't in cramped, crowded spaces and allowed those kind of diseases to start to form and spread from species to species. Obviously, reducing industrial animal agriculture should reduce those sorts of events. And then finally, I think what's relevant to the news today is people may be familiar with the African swine fever or flu. I forget the exact name, but it's essentially wiped out a quarter of the world's pig supply in less than a year. And that has, basically risen the pork prices in specifically Asian regions like China, Vietnam, Japan, et cetera, that are apparently eat a heavy pork-based diet. And so I think, one advantage that is less talked about is the sort of kind of on-demand or prevention of these sorts of large problems in supply chain and price fluctuations moving forward. So a lot more predictable in terms of what can be produced if you use these methods.
Okay, so here's a tough one. You're inside the industry, so bust out your crystal ball and tell us when are things going to hit the shelves? What should we think about for time frames here?
Yeah, certainly it's the hardest question to answer. But I'd say if you ask the companies in this space and you ask me, I think there are a few companies that could probably release a product today in a really luxury restaurant setting at a high price point in pretty low volumes. It wouldn't be a steak or anything like that. It might be a sausage or a chicken nugget or something unstructured. But we're at the point where, that's possible today. It's just that the regulation and perhaps the fear of not having it a perfect product yet is kind of holding some companies back. So certainly once the regulation gets a little more smoothed out, I think we may see product introductions in countries like Singapore, which have been especially favorable from a governmental perspective in welcoming these technologies due to their kind of high reliance on importing food and their food security issues in the future, potentially. But I think really what's important is the question of, when are consumers going to be able to find this on their, similarly to how plant-based products are becoming available now, like at a Burger King or in the supermarket. Those timelines are a lot more difficult to really pin down. I don't feel comfortable saying anything shorter than maybe 7 years when something like that begins to come on. I think from an infrastructure and capital perspective of what needs to kind of be established and the amount of money that needs to go into really doing the R&D early on to make sure these processes are efficient from a cost perspective, et cetera. It takes a lot of work. So certainly a little bit longer timelines there, but don't be surprised if these products start coming out in restaurant settings in the next year or two.
In the restaurant setting sooner. Okay. Wow.
Yeah, it's just that I would imagine at fairly high price points and in really kind of luxury settings in low volume. But yeah.
And more mass market utilization likely within the new decade, huh?
Yeah, I mean, it is certainly the hope, and the more and more people that get involved in this space that are solving problems around cost and different technical issues, I think the more and more likely that is to be achieved. So, so far, so good.
I just think about the big issues we have about our environmental impact, our water requirements, petroleum, reliance upon petroleum products. This affects so many of those things. So it's just really exciting.
Yes, and I think, people are still a little bit left in the dark in terms of the real specifics and the real data on how sustainable this production method is going to be. And that's true because really the production system doesn't quite necessarily exist yet, certainly not at a scale that, would resemble a true kind of production facility that we envision in the future. And to obtain those types of data, you can perform a sort of life cycle assessment that looks at the inputs, all of the upstream kind of raw materials that are needed and the sort of environmental costs and footprints of the facility that you're operating and building. And so we've begun a collaborative project with various players in the industry that are creating cultivated meat, as well as kind of getting the oversight from other life science companies that have experience in, let's say, constructing facilities or producing media and things like that for the cells to grow. And so really excited to get the results of this project probably later this year. That will be pretty much the most comprehensive look at the environmental impact of this process. We essentially know that the land requirements are going to be significantly reduced, but some of the prospective kind of life cycle assessments that have been done have a higher kind of uncertainty around the energy use of a facility and how that can relate and compare to, let's say, the production of a chicken, which is quite efficient. In a lot of different ways compared to, let's say, a cow. And so, the product that you're making is going to change in terms of the efficiency gains that you're trying to take away. So, a lot of questions there, but things look generally favorable overall. It's when you really truly think about it from a thermodynamic perspective, right. You look at the kind of
exactly what I was thinking.
Simply if you take these are data from the World Resources Institute, but essentially if you put in 9 calories worth of feed into a chicken, which is the most efficient animal, you get about 1 food calorie out. And so you're basically have a huge loss of the amount of inputs that you're using. People think cultivated meat is more along the lines of like a 1 to 2 caloric equivalent to produce 1 calorie of meat. And so the efficiency gains there, just because you're not, losing all of the energy to metabolism of growing an entire animal, you're just growing what you need. Those are just massive. And I think that will hold true for this industry.
Well, you're growing a whole lot of biomass you're not planning on using in that way, but also you're having to sustain that biomass for such a long period of time.
Yeah, absolutely. And the time frames here are generally on the order of weeks, most likely, rather than months to years. And so, absolutely, you can definitely get much more efficiency gains in a shorter amount of time using these methodologies as well. I would also mention just on this point, because we talk about growing an animal, and in the traditional meat industry, a lot of the things that are used that are not meat go into other sectors, like leather, for instance, from a cow, or to create other things like gelatin. And it's worth mentioning that there are companies that are also pursuing the production of leather grown from animal cells. So basically fibroblasts that secrete collagen to produce a leather-like material, as well as companies that are producing collagen specifically to make gelatin for food additives. And so not only is the kind of meat industry being disrupted by these technologies, but the meat byproduct industry is also being disrupted as well. And so, things don't look too good around, industrial animal agriculture sustaining itself in the long term, as these more efficient methods of production of pretty much everything that you need from an animal begin to come online.
I've got a 16-year-old son, and my hope is that he'll tell his grandkids about when he was young how we ate animals for food and we drove our own cars.
It's true that, in the future, those sorts of scenarios could certainly be existence. Like, what? You grew animals for feed? That just sounds insane. Yeah, correct.
So if someone's listening and they think, hey, this is pretty amazing stuff, I want to check this out further, I want to be involved in some way, where would you direct them?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, there's a lot of different avenues to learn more. Certainly our website, we kind of sit at the middle of this entire meat alternative industry, and that's www.gfi.org. And so if people are familiar with us, we're essentially a international nonprofit. So all of our work is funded by philanthropic donors. And we operate mostly in the United States, but we have teams in Brazil, Israel, the Asia Pacific region, India, and Europe. Obviously, if you want to disrupt food, food doesn't always happen in the United States. And so a global focus is really necessary to drive these sorts of technologies to fruition. And all of our resources that we create, which include things like industry reports or introductory learning materials or free online courses, can be found throughout our website. We have kind of a resources pages for different audiences, whether you're a scientist, whether you're an investor, or whether you're just hoping to learn more. So really encourage people to check that out. And then from there, certainly there's beginning to be more and more peer-reviewed literature on this topic as more and more academic labs become interested in the topic. And then in general, I think a good way to stay in tune is to try to, hop on social media and start following some people on Twitter that are involved in this sector, myself included, is how I get a lot of the kind of updates in the media that are tracking the industry. And I think that's a good way to kind of keep up to date with what's going on.
Well, Elliot, this has been awesome. We're going to put links to all those things up here on the show notes, the page. And thank you so much. Really appreciate your time.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me. Definitely an important topic to discuss. So glad more and more people are becoming interested in what's going on.
All right, Dr. Steve here with you, another episode of Medical Myths, Legends, and Fairy Tales. Thanks so much for being here, and I'll see you again real soon.
Hey, Dr. Christianson here. Thanks so much for joining me for another episode. Is there a topic you'd like me to cover? I'd love to hear from you. Just go to Dr. Alan Christianson on Facebook or Instagram, write your question, and use the hashtag #MedicalMyths. Did you find this show helpful? If so, please take a minute and leave us a rating on iTunes so that others can know. Thanks much, and I'll be back with you real soon. Bye-bye.